Jesus and Mary? No. Today we celebrate the memorial of St. Francis de Sales, who was born in his parents' castle in the Duchy of Savoy in 1567. Today what's left of that castle is in France near the Swiss border. He was the first of 13 children, and so his father planned a political career for his firstborn to serve the family's interests. After his initial schooling at Roche, he was sent off to Annecy at 8. He was accompanied by the court chaplain, the Abbé d'Aisne, who would supervise him throughout the period of his studies. There he received confirmation and First Communion. At 14, he left for Paris, where he would study for the next 7 years. His father wanted him in the College de Navarre with the other sons of aristocrats. There he could make connections that would serve him for the future. But he asked to study instead with the Jesuits. This would be better for his spiritual life, and he was granted this. Already from the age of 12, he felt called to the priesthood. He studied rhetoric and philosophy, but his favorite subjects were theology and scripture. His father also made sure he learned the skills needed for his state in life: riding, fencing, and dancing. When he was about 19, he had a profound spiritual crisis. He was thinking about the problem of predestination and wondered whether he might not wind up damned in the end. If so, everything he was doing to serve God would be in vain. For 6 weeks he was tormented by these thoughts. Then, when things were at their worst, he entered a church and knelt before a miraculous image of Our Lady and prayed to her. He was suddenly delivered from despair. He would not worry about what his faith might be. He would just spend the time that he had now serving God, the time he had now loving God. Without seeking any reward, he would simply entrust himself to God's mercy. He made a vow of chastity and consecrated himself to the Blessed Virgin Mary, who had saved him. After he finished his course of studies at Paris, he wanted to remain to study theology, but his father insisted that he study law at Padua. So he went with his tutor to Padua, where he studied law for his father and theology for himself. After a little over 3 years, he obtained the doctorate in civil and canon law and also in theology with top marks. When he came home in 1592, he still hadn't said anything to his family about his vocation. His father had arranged everything for his career. He had found a nice girl of high nobility for him to marry and secured him a position in the Senate of Chambéry. But how could he tell his father? He confided his secret to his cousin Louis, who was a canon at the Annecy Cathedral. Without saying anything to St. Francis, Louis secured papers appointing him provost of the diocese, the highest position after the bishop. If his father wanted his son to use his talents and have a career, there it was. He presented these papers to St. Francis, who then approached his father with those papers and a story. 3 times on the way back from Chambéry, he had fallen off his horse, and each time his sword and scabbard had fallen to form a perfect cross. But that sign wasn't enough to convince his father, who angrily refused to allow his son to abandon law and become a priest. But in the months that followed, his faith triumphed over his ambition, and he let his son be ordained. St. Francis was so well prepared that 3 weeks after he got his father's permission, he was ordained a deacon, and 6 months after that, a priest on December 18, 1593. He was 26 at the time. He was now provost of the Diocese of Geneva, whose clergy lived in exile in Annecy, because Geneva was a Protestant stronghold. The Chablais was contested territory, alternately conquered and lost. A 1589 treaty, however, allowed for the re-establishment of Catholic worship in the Chablais, but missionaries would be needed to do it. St. Francis and his cousin Louis volunteered. It was dangerous work. Less than 1% of the population was still Catholic, and they were afraid to declare themselves openly because opposition to Catholicism was often violent. The 2 priests stayed in a forest at night and ventured forth by day. Once St. Francis was attacked by wolves and spent the night in a tree in the cold. Twice he miraculously escaped being waylaid by Protestants who had sworn to kill him. And their efforts bore little fruit at first. Few wanted to listen to them. Then St. Francis hit on the idea of writing leaflets. They were copied by hand and slipped under doors or posted in public places. They compared Catholic doctrine with Calvinism and convinced many that the Catholic faith was true. In 1595, he was climbing a mountain to restore an oratory to Our Lady that the Calvinists had destroyed, but a crowd attacked him and beat him. Not long after that, more people started coming to hear his sermons, however, and the number of Catholics and Catholic sympathizers grew to the point that he no longer had to spend nights in the fortress. He could stay in the city and have public debates with Calvinist leaders. In 1597, at the request of the Pope, he went to Geneva to meet Theodore Beza, the spiritual leader of the city. Beza was then 80 and could not be convinced to abandon his beliefs, but he did seem shaken at times as they spoke. Then the aging Catholic Bishop of Geneva wanted to have St. Francis appointed his coadjutor, and therefore his successor. This wasn't something that the saint wanted to accept, but the bishop insisted so much that he came to believe that it was God's will. To be appointed, he had to be examined by a board in Rome, so he went there. St. Robert Bellarmine and the historian Cardinal Baronius were among those who tested his knowledge and orthodoxy. Pope Clement VIII said he'd never been more satisfied with a candidate. This was in 1599. Early in 1602, St. Francis's bishop sent him to Paris on a mission. There, besides meeting King Henry IV, he also met St. Vincent de Paul and Devout, who was leading the French school of spirituality and later became a cardinal. The king was very impressed with the saint. He had him preach for Lent and wanted to have him appointed to a more important diocese. But St. Francis replied, "Sire, I have married a poor wife, and I cannot desert her for a richer." On December 8th of that year, the Bishop of Geneva died, and St. Francis de Sales succeeded him. He was ordained a bishop. He continued to live simply, however, and promoted the teaching of catechism throughout his diocese. In 1604, he met St. Jane Frances de Chantal, who had been widowed 3 years before. She wanted to enter religious life, and St. Francis agreed that she was called, but it would not be possible yet because she still had young children. So it was only in 1610 that she could begin to live as one of the first members or the foundress of the Visitation Order. Originally, they were supposed to be like Mary in the Visitation, going out to help those in need. But society wasn't ready to accept a religious order like that. It was considered folly to have consecrated women wandering about in the world instead of safe in their cloister, and people didn't hesitate to tell St. Francis that to his face. In the end, he accepted the insuperable opposition as a sign of God's will, and the Visitation Order became cloistered like other orders of women. In 1609, he published Introduction to the Devout Life, probably his best-known work. This started out as letters of spiritual counsel to a cousin, but she showed the letters to a Jesuit, who convinced St. Francis to make it into a book. He teaches that true devotion consists in a constant, resolute, prompt, and active will to do whatever we know is pleasing to God. But the way this devotion is lived out depends on your state in life. All can and must pursue holiness, but each in his own way. Each in a way appropriate to his duties in life, to his abilities, to the talents that God has given him. Vatican II did not invent the idea that we're all called to holiness, it just reminded us of it. In 1622, he had to make yet another trip to Paris, but he seemed to know that he wasn't coming back because he set his affairs in order before he left the diocese. On his way back, he stopped at the Visitation Convent in Lyon, where he spent a month giving instructions and advice to the nuns. On December 27th, he had a stroke. He regained his consciousness and speech, but died the next day at the age of 55. He was beatified fairly quickly in 1661 and canonized 4 years later. In 1877, Blessed Pius IX declared him a doctor of the Church, and in 1923, Pius XI named him patron of Catholic writers and journalists, who, in the hope that, like him, they will use their words to spread the faith. Praised be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.